Joshua's going to talk about the principles of soil health this morning. So let's give a big Virginia welcome to Joshua.
Am I live?
Yep.
Okay, I'm wired up enough here. I feel like I'm going to take off here pretty quick. So we'll make sure that I don't walk too close to a flame or anything like that. Well, it's certainly a pleasure to be here, and like Chris said, it was a little bit of a challenge getting here, but if today's anything like yesterday, it was well worth the trip, and of course I get to do 4 days like this, and of course the opportunity for me is to not only see some additional country that I haven't really had a lot of exposure to, but probably most importantly, I get exposure to lots of additional people. And of course, I come to conferences with the intent, whether I'm speaking or not, I come with the intent to learn, and I've already learned a tremendous amount, both from producers and agency and university and others that are in attendance, as well as the crew that I've been able to travel around with. Now, yesterday I was feeling pretty guilty when I talked to my wife at home, because the temperature difference between central North Dakota and Bismarck, where I live, and Blackstone, where I was at yesterday, the difference was about 80 degrees. Now, from what I understand, we were close to 50 or somewhere in that range in Blackstone yesterday, and of course you can do the math and find out just how cold it was at home. I'm not feeling quite as guilty today. Okay, we're only about 30 degrees difference, so we'll see how it goes, and I'm going to share with you the what, the how, the why with soil health, and I'm going to come at it from the perspective of a combination of hats that I wear. I do work with the Burleigh County Soil Conservation District, which is a county-based soil district in North Dakota. I'm also a coordinator with the Grazing Lands Coalition, which functions very similar to the Forage Council here. That's an entity, a statewide entity in North Dakota. As well, I'm a holistic management educator and teacher and consultant. And if that wasn't enough, I decided I needed to run some cows of my own. So with all that, you're going to see a number of different perspectives that I'll try and touch on and utilize. And just keep in mind, both this morning when I speak and this afternoon, that I'm here to try and fill a role. Okay, I'm here to try and challenge you. I'm here not to offend you, but if I touch on some nerves, understand that I'm trying to scoot you out of your comfort zone just a little bit, or be a part of your team for a day and help you brainstorm things that might not have been considered before, or things that you could look at from a different angle. So, like I said, I'm going to try and push you a little bit today, and I know that's when I learn, is when somebody expands my window or gets me to think about something a little bit different. The other thing that has become pretty common when I go to a workshop, and I promise we'll get to the first slide here in just a second. But when you go to workshops or conferences or tours, I generally have some questions in mind based on what I saw on the agenda, or who's speaking, or what kind of topics are going to be discussed. And I found it more and more common that as I went to more and more of these over the years, I would go with a few questions and I'd come home with way more questions than I went with. And in some cases, early on, I thought, boy, that was kind of a failure. Now I consider it the opposite. Okay, if I come, it's not about finding absolute answers to the questions. It's about asking the questions in the first place, so that we are in that investigation mode, we're in that thinking mode, we're in that expanding our window mode. Now, I'm not saying answers aren't important, and we rely on lots of people and experiences and trial and error to get some of those answers, but we need to be asking the right questions in the first place in order to know that our time and energy is spent in the most effective way possible. So I'm going to start with a question. How many here would like to leave the land better than when they found it? Wonderful. I would say that's generally a majority, whether it's land that you manage yourself, or if you're in a position where you help others manage land or cattle, whether it's grass, soils, whatever your emphasis is, I would say that's pretty common, and that's admirable and a good thing. Is that actually happening, big picture, across our landscapes? If we're truly honest with ourselves, many times we at least should hesitate before we answer yes, and in many times we might even shake our heads no, that this is not necessarily happening, at least not to the level that that it should or even that it could. And in my opinion, in every landscape, the ceiling is many times higher than what we give it credit for or where we think we can go. We get so entrenched in the challenges of the day that we don't see it as big picture moving forward. Past or present? Some say past, some say present. The answer is both, quite honestly. This one down here in the bottom probably dates itself some because it's a black and white photo. And although I can't say that I can go outside here and in this area or in the area I was in yesterday and say that I can find that because I haven't spent enough time, I can go find this for you in North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa. I can find that sort of thing. The picture right next to it is actually Jay Fearer. He's a district conservationist that in the office that I work with the Soil Conservation District. And I don't know if you can see it real well, but right here it says 2008. This here is a steel fence post, or at least what's showing of it. That ditch is full of topsoil. That cash, that money, that value's not coming back, at least not onto that field. Okay, it's probably going to be collected somewhere else. This one here is in the mid-90s. That's on some rangeland in the western United States. This here is Texas in 2012. Okay, these things are not only happening, and maybe because of the communication technology that we have, but it seems like we're becoming more aware of those things again. Okay, they have remnants of a time, a past time that most of us just hear about or read about. But unfortunately, it's alarming, and if we're really going to work on soil health, we can't lose the very thing that we need to build soil health, and that's the soil itself. So the first step, or one of the main principles here, is the fact that we need to not only take care of that soil and keep it in place, but we need to do more than conservation. Okay, we need to go beyond conservation. Now, that's not to say conservation is bad, because I think it's actually good. I've worked for conservation agencies in some way, shape, or form my entire career. And it's a wonderful first step. But if we want to even start to throw that word sustainable around, we have to talk about a different kind of agriculture, a different kind of land management, in my opinion, because why would we want to conserve something that's already degraded? Okay, isn't conserving something basically stopping the bleeding? Isn't it, holding it from getting any worse or minimizing the losses? I'm not interested in playing prevent defense. Okay, and unfortunately, coming from North Dakota, we don't have our own professional football team, but there's a state real close to there, which unfortunately I'm a fan of. Okay, would be the Vikings. Okay, normally that gets more laughs in the upper Midwest because they feel a whole lot more sorry for me. Okay. But they go into this thing at the end of games, even if they have the lead, and maybe your types of teams do too, but they go into this prevent defense. And it just frustrates me. On our landscape, a lot of times we will go into a prevent type defense. We're just trying to slow the losses down. When we have complete ability to not only stop those losses, but to actually build soil. Okay, build it down, build it up. Actually give credit to the soil and utilize the soil for its three-dimensional qualities that it has, not just two-dimensional. When somebody asks you about your farm or your ranch, what do you tell them? If they say, how big is your ranch? You tell them how many acres you have, how many fields you have, how many pastures you have. You ever tell them the depth of your soil? Your real estate is three-dimensional. Are you using all three dimensions? If we're losing some of that dimension, we certainly aren't taking the credit for it that we could, or utilizing all that we can. So I really think regenerative management should be on the radar, and it is possible. Okay, I've seen it, I've participated in it, and that's the main focus on our particular operation as well. Okay, so most of the time people ask, well, you're from North Dakota. What on earth are you going to come down here and tell us? Well, I'm not going to tell you to do anything. I'm not going to hand you a recipe. I'm not going to give you a prescription. You can rely on other people to do that because there's plenty of them out there. But I can tell you a little bit of what we do and how we do it, but probably the most important thing I can tell you is why we do it. And I'll discuss a little bit of not only why, but then over the course of this presentation and in all of the presentations today, you should be able to start formulating your own methods in what you're going to do to accomplish what it is you're after. Now, Burleigh County is a county that's about 1 million acres in size, south central North Dakota, about half from an agricultural standpoint, it's about half cropping, half grazing, or half grassland. There's the monthly spread of precipitation. We're in about a 16-inch zone on average. Now, we can end up in droughts where we get 6 to 8 inches. We can end up on the higher end and be 20 to 22 inches at times. But for the most part, we're in that 16-inch moisture range. May, June, first part of July is where the bulk of our moisture comes from. Okay? In the fall, we rarely get much for moisture. In the late summer, we rarely get much for moisture. Summer temperatures, highs 90 to 100, although we probably don't experience the humidity that you probably do in this area. And of course, the cold temperatures, well, let's just say when we bury our frost-free pipelines, we have to put them 7 to 8 feet in the ground because it'll freeze that deep if we want to use that water during the winter. So just give you a little idea of the cold factor that goes along with it. Now, one of my favorite things to do, and as much as I spend quite a bit of time indoors speaking and teaching and that sort of thing during the winter months, because that's probably a little nicer place to be in the northern plains, one of my favorite things to do is to get out excuse me, on the land and take a walk. Crop field, pasture, garden, whatever it might be. And one of the things I really try and do is I try and study it. Now, I'm nowhere near as good as those kind of people that can walk out on a piece of property they've never been on before, come back 15 minutes later and tell you everything that's happened on that land the last 5 years. I'm not that good, at least maybe someday, but I'm not that good. But what I can do is ask lots of questions. And this might sound a little corny of you, but I ask questions of the land. Okay, what's your psyche right now? How do you feel? What have you been through? What kind of baggage are you carrying based on previous management? Okay, what's your potential? Just like all of us can maybe not be feeling the best any given day, but we can probably put on a pretty good game face. Okay, land can do the same thing. It's pretty resilient. It continues to try and grow something if at all possible. Not always what we want. But that's why we got to look not only above ground, but we can't stop there. We have to go below ground. We have to look at what's happening in the soil. That's the foundation, just like the foundation to a building. Without the foundation, the rest of it's going to either do really, really struggle, or if it's a good foundation, it will be really strong. But we have to look at both. And quite honestly, if I ever go to the field and I don't take a big knife or a shovel or something to dig around in the soil with me, it's kind of a lost opportunity to really see what's going on. Now, some of the things that I look for, some of the things that from a soil health standpoint that I consider to be important, one of them, and this is a big item to me, is the water cycle itself. What does the water do when it hits the soil surface? Once it hits the soil surface, then where does it go? Does it run off? Does it infiltrate? Once it infiltrates, does it stay there, or does it keep on going? Does it perch? Is it held in there so when we have a dry spell, we actually have some water in our bucket, okay, absorbed by that organic matter, available to us when we actually need it? You see, you'll go through dry spells, but you've always got water at the tap, right? You've always got water coming from your shower, okay, because there's storage somewhere. Okay, we're looking at creating storage in our soil, so when we get those events that are big, we can take them in. And when we're short, or when we don't get moisture for a while, we've got a source to tap into. This here is a picture in Australia. This gentleman here, his name is Brian Marshall. He's a rancher. He's a holistic educator. And I know that a lot of times the rain will stop at my fence line or my road, or you get more on your section than I get on my section, or more on your property than I get on mine. But we've heard about the long extended droughts in Australia, right? And when I say long and extended droughts, we're talking 5, 10, 15. Some of the Australians will even tell you they've been in a drought for 30 years. Now, I'm not saying soil health is going to cure all your ills with a drought or a flood, but there is certainly a buffering effect that can be created. How many animals do you think would survive over on that side? Probably not many. Yesterday the answer was maybe a couple kangaroos, okay, but not many cows. This over here, although he's probably destocked some because that was the smart thing to do, you can see kind of an electric tape here and a post. Who's got the opportunity? This is probably as drastic and dynamic a picture as I can show you on effective water cycle versus ineffective water cycle. But the thing is, the water cycle is a constant on all landscapes. Now it might deal with different soils, different vegetation, different slopes, and obviously different management, but water cycle we can influence. And it starts with managing the health of the soil. How about the mineral cycle? Okay, fertility is a big item when we start talking about inputs and costs of trying to grow grass, raise beef or lamb or whatever type of animals you use, to raise hay, to raise forage, annuals, whatever it might be. But the thing is here, in most environments, if we take this critter out of the loop, how well does that cycle work? Anybody ever, how many here have a baler? You don't have to be shy about it. You can. There we go. If you have a baler, you've probably got some gears on there, right? Okay? Some sprockets, some gears, and they've got cogs on those gears. What happens if 2 or 3 or more of those teeth on that gear break off? Doesn't work real well, does it? That chain slips. Maybe it even comes off of that gear. Okay? Should we expect our environment to function if we take some cogs off of that wheel? We at least shouldn't expect it to function to the same level. Now we can talk about food and we can talk about waste, and in nature I tend to stay away from the word waste because I think there's always a role somewhere, somehow that everything fills. But if we have this excess growth of this plant becomes food for the animal, okay, and the waste or the nutrient-rich deposit that the animal makes becomes food for soils, the biology. That goes through a process, and of course this is a very simple way of trying to portray this, but then it provides or excretes nutrients for plant roots, and the cycle goes round and round and round. Take this critter out, and what happens? All of a sudden it's short-circuited. Okay, now you say, well, I have animals, so I don't need to worry about that. How many of you have hayland? And do animals graze your hayland every year? Okay, if they do, wonderful. But if you have hayland, like we do, and have had in the past, where you have it in for a number of years, and then you got to figure out what to do with it because it's lost its steam, okay, it's lost its gas, it's not producing like it should, and someone says, well, you better take it out, you better crop it, better, add fertilizer to it or manure to it or whatever so you can build that back up, and then eventually you can go back to hay. Well, it makes sense that it ran out of steam, right? What do we do with hay? We take, and we take, and we take, and we take. And what are you taking? Bales? Certainly. What's in those bales? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, carbon, and a bunch of other things. So the idea that these animals can play a tool, and we'll talk more about that this afternoon. We'll see how we can enhance that mineral cycle or maybe put it back into the equation the way that it normally functions. How about the power of diversity? Now, one of the things that I have learned is, and I knew this, but to what extent I had to become more clear, fescue is obviously a pretty dominant type of forage species around here, correct? Okay? And that comes with good and bad, if I understand right. If you're talking during the dormant season or winter months, so to speak, there's a type of forage that is usable, and a lot of times if it's stockpiled, it's plentiful, that sort of thing. But if you get into the heat of the summer, a little bit of an issue. Okay, it's something that you obviously have to pay attention to, have to manage accordingly. The thing with diversity, and one of the advantages, and maybe it's an unfair advantage, I'm not sure, but one of the advantages we have in our areas, we have native prairie, okay, ground that's never been broke. And although it's been invaded by a number of different species, it's still predominantly that native prairie. What do you think that native prairie has? We're talking hundreds of species per acre. Okay? It becomes our template that we try and mimic our cropping systems, our haying systems, our cover crops, and even grazing where we're down to 1 or 2 or 3 species. We mimic our management, we try and do things to try and recreate this native prairie. Now we're maybe necessarily never going to recreate it completely. And because our landscape is more fragmented than it used to be when the large herds used to come across and create their impact, we may never get back to the original prairie. But the concepts are still there. The principles of how they feed soil biology. When you have diversity, whether it's plants, whether it's animals, what about the intense and terrorizing predator of a ladybug? Now, when my daughter, who's just over 2, when she has a ladybug on her finger, she thinks it's just the cutest thing in the world. And gets really upset when it flies away and she can't find it. Okay, I haven't told her yet that it's a pretty massive predator. Okay, and I might not tell her that for maybe a few years. But do you think of it that way? Do you think about this predator-prey relationship and the roles that everything eats and everything feeds something else at all of these different levels? And the thing is, with all of this diversity taking place, so much of the work gets done for you. Now, you still have to manage, you still have to think, you still have to plan, you still have to monitor. I'm not saying that you walk away and everything just takes care of itself and let it go back to nature. Humans are an integral part of nature. We always have been. Okay? But understanding the concepts of diversity can help buffer from extremes. It can help do a lot of the labor for you. But we have to account for all items, including ladybugs, earthworms, goats, cows, different kinds of plants, warm seasons, cool seasons, kind of all of the above. Okay? And the last one here that I try and pay attention to is the flow of energy. Okay? Now that title on this slide is a little bit funny because I didn't come up with that. That was actually a couple who had their son sitting right next to them, okay, that put that one out on their list of objectives when I taught a 3-day class a couple winters ago. And their idea, of course, originally was, well, they want to be able to bring their son back to the operation, the next generation, make that all work, and in the process thought, well, we really have 2 sons. Okay, they have a son and a daughter, but they really have 2 sons that they want to put to work. Okay, one is their son, okay, the one that they raised and have high hopes for. The other one is the sun that shines on all of us. Okay? Do you have to give anything to the sun for it to shine on you? And we can cover all of the crazy and sarcastic statements about where the sun shines and all those things. Okay? But the point is there's always solar energy out there to collect. Are you collecting it every hour of every day that you possibly can, and are you collecting it with growing plants? Okay, in North Dakota, one of the things that always gets talked about is, oh, we have limitations because we have a short growing season. Okay, we only have 90 days. We only have maybe 100 days. Maybe it's a little more than that some years. And then they'll grow a crop that lasts 50 days or 60 days and say, well, our growing season's too short. And I understand that they're talking about not having enough time to seed another full crop, take it to maturity, and harvest it. To harvest solar energy, do you have to get all the way to seed production? Certainly not. To feed animals, do you have to take it all the way to maturity? Many times you don't even want it to go to maturity to help feed those animals, or don't need it to go to maturity. So growing larger plants, more plants, it's always interesting to me when I drive down the road and there's a pasture on either side of the road and one's growing in early April in North Dakota and the next one isn't going to start for another 3 weeks. There's something going on there, okay? If you can start your growing season a week early and last a week longer at the end of the year than what's normal or typical, I know that would certainly be a big advantage for us. You can determine whether that would be for you. So if we're going to take these cycles and we're going to consider soils as a big part of that, how many here have taken a livestock nutrition course or work as a nutritionist? Good. Now you know the importance of being able to provide the full level of nutrition through an entire time period, whatever time period you're asked to formulate it for, right? And in this case here, we're talking about January through December or a whole year. Okay? And what's the point of putting together this forage chain? is to make sure you have something available at all times. Overlap is better than a gap, right? Okay, certainly. How many of you have put together a forage chain for your herd below ground? How many have even thought about it? I would suggest that your herd below ground is more important than your herd above ground. Okay, it's the whole foundation concept again. Now, if you say, oh, nothing's more important than my cows, I love my cows. I'm not going to say your cows are bad. I'm not going to say that you do a bad job or anything like that. All I'm trying to do is get you to consider that even if you have land and you have no livestock, you still kind of have livestock. You can't see them all, and you certainly won't see most of them unless you dig in the soil, and some of them you won't even see unless you get out a microscope. But having an appreciation for them, understanding their basic function in their role in nature, their role in farming and ranching, becomes a really big item. When you hear about producers being able to raise crops and grow grass and they're really low input, or some of them will even call them no input, although I think there's still human creativity and labor and some other things that go into it. They talk about no fertilizer or no fertility. They talk about no herbicides or any of the other biocides. They talk about not needing all of these inputs, or at least not anymore. Now, they didn't get there overnight. It probably took them years in order to move in that direction, although I think we can move there quicker than we sometimes think. But it's because we've provided the opportunity for these microbes to step up to the plate and start playing their role. You came in here today, you got your name tag, you got your packet of information, you probably came over here and you got some coffee and some water or some rolls or donuts, and you sat down where you're at. And you're probably fairly comfortable right now, okay? Now, for the rest of the day, and I'm not promising to do this, but for the rest of the day, if I brought you everything that you needed, okay, I brought you more coffee, I brought you more water, I brought you more snacks. When mealtime came at noon, I went and got your meal and I brought it to you. Okay, if you needed more paper, I would go and get that for you. If you needed another pen, I'd get that for you. Would you have any reason to get up and to go anywhere? Well, it might depend on how much coffee I give you. You're exactly right. But the point is that you're pretty lax because you don't necessarily need to do much. And you might still listen and participate, but you don't really need to do a whole lot. Well, on our soils, if we provide the full nutrition, or what we think is full nutrition, for the plants or the soils themselves, each time, every year, in every situation, do they have any reason to want to participate or come to the party? Because they don't have a role. They don't have this place. And some of them are still going to be there. But the point is that over time, we've worked with producers that slowly start to back off on those inputs, slowly start to wean themselves off of those things, and slow but sure, they don't necessarily suffer too much. They might have a dip at first in production or that sort of thing. But it's the idea of being able to take one step back so they can leap ahead 2 or 3 or 10 steps forward. And it's because the biology comes to play. Now, some of these below ground players, and Dr. Rayburn's going to touch a little bit more on some of the functionality of these, but there's some of these like the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, even the nematodes. We're talking about critters. These are all microscopic images. Now, some of them, if you dig up some soil and look really, really closely, you can see some of what goes on, or some of their colonization. If we get to the arthropods and the earthworms, those are much easier to spot. How many here have looked for dung beetles on their place? Okay. When you saw your first dung beetle, how excited did you get? Pretty excited? Some say, well, I really got excited, but I'm not going to tell anybody else that I got excited about bugs and poop. I was able to do a youth pasture walk a couple years ago. Time flies, probably 3 or 4 years ago. And on this pasture walk, it was a youth one, and it was ages 9 to, 14 or 15. And of course, my main concern is keeping these kids' attention. Okay? In keeping their attention, I thought, well, I have to have a couple tricks or a couple aces up my sleeve to play if I need to. Well, unfortunately, Josh panicked like 10 minutes into this pasture walk, and I've got 3 hours to do. And one of my aces was the dung beetle card, because I'd gone out to the operation ahead of time, looked through the pastures, made sure that there was dung beetles there, and they were plentiful, okay, a well-managed place. And so I got in there and I saw a couple kids kind of stray. Like I said, 10 minutes in, I pull away some of this manure, open it up, and of course the dung beetles go crazy. I say, come look at this. They come over. I pretty much get shoved out of the way. And for the rest of the day, I wouldn't have had to say anything. Because every dung pile looked like there was wild badgers traveling through that pasture. Everyone was turned over. The kids went crazy. I'm not exactly sure what they told their parents they learned that day, or the fact that I might have gotten in trouble for all of what they had on their clothes. But the point is they identified a critter that they got excited about, and being kids, that's one of the things I try and encourage the most, is to be able to get excited about agriculture in this way. And all it was a dung beetle. We were talking about a pretty impressive critter, something that will deposit fertility for you, spread and distribute fertility for you, put it in the soil, compete against fly populations, bring along a team of mites with it in order to compete with the fly populations, and all of a sudden, you have another ally. You see, if all these bugs, above ground, below ground, in the air, on the surface, come into balance, all of a sudden you have a very strategic team that plays a very important role. Actually, multiple roles through all of this. What we have to do is make sure that we're managing in such a way to make sure that they have food and that they have an environment to live in. Okay? Field of Dreams, what's the big quote? If you build it, they will. Okay? I feel the same way about soil biology and all of these other insects that are out there, and all of the other critters. They don't even have to be insects. They can be birds. They can be other animals as well. So thinking about how you want to build this environment, okay, we talked about why you want to build it. Now we're talking a little bit about how you want to build this environment, how you want to provide the food and the home, and hopefully complement it with some moisture or water along the way. Kind of real basic things that we need, same things that they need. How many here think that we can be 100% efficient and yet 0% effective? Now, I'm not asking for you to necessarily raise your hand. I just want you to think about this. Can we do everything the right way, but not be doing any of the right things? I think we can. Now, keep in mind, this is an extreme, so I'm not projecting that you guys are doing all the wrong things. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I am suggesting is that many times we get entrenched in trying to do things the right way. We have to back up a step and make sure we're shooting at the right target in the first place. It doesn't matter how fast we go if we're going in the wrong direction. And that's what this is all about. Effectiveness is all about direction. Efficiency is all about power and speed and rate. So is efficiency still important? Absolutely. But have to make sure that we're utilizing that efficiency in the right way and traveling with it in the right direction. So with that in mind, here's another question for you. Which grazing model do you use, or do you promote, or do you plan? Look at all these, and we could make a whole nother list of even more. There's continuous season long, there's switchback, there's a hay graze, there's a deferment, a rest rotation, there's a simple rotation, there's management intensive grazing or MIG type grazing, which there's some really good books out there actually on the, and I would suggest that it by itself, anytime you label something, eventually someone takes it and compacts it into something specific, and it needs to be flexible, it needs to be larger than that. How about mob grazing? Anybody utilizing any mob grazing? Okay. Is mob grazing the silver bullet to everything? Most likely not. Is it an appropriate tool to use at certain times? I think it probably is. But you got to know why you're using it. You got to have a purpose behind it. Because all of these are great, but when you lock yourself into and identify yourself as that type of grazer or that type of rancher or that type of cowboy or farmer or agriculturalist, whatever it is, then you've locked yourself into a method, not a principle, not a concept, but a method. And there's tons of methods out there, but we have to lock ourselves into something a little different. And this last one down here is my best attempt at a summary of utilizing any and all of these in the appropriate situations, and that's grazing for ecosystem health. But we could throw in there that and we'll talk about this afternoon, but we'll talk about how we should graze for wealth, biological, paper dollar wealth, bank account wealth, quality of life wealth, all of those. So here it is. This is just a quote, Ralph Waldo Emerson. It says, "As to methods, there may be 1,000,000 and then some, but principles are few. But those that can grasp the principles can successfully select the methods that they need to get there." Are your methods in Virginia going to be different than in North Dakota? I would sure hope so. Okay? How you manage animals during the winter, do you think you need to put your pipelines 7 or 8 feet in the ground? Unless you've got lots of money that you're looking to bury, I don't think you probably need to. Don't get stuck on the methods. Don't get stuck on listening to some crazy North Dakotan telling you this is the method we use and think, well, that doesn't work here. Of course it might not work here. But can you open up enough to where you can say, okay, I see what he's doing or what they're doing, but here's the underlying principle. Here's the underlying ecological truth, as Dr. Rayburn is going to talk more about. And then you step up to the plate and say, these are the methods that I'm going to use. And it might be something similar to what we use. It might be just an adaptation or tweaking a bit, but it's the principles, not the methods themselves. Common denominator in all of this, forestry, gardening, cropping, wildlife grazing, whatever it is, soil health is that common denominator. And we're taught a lot of parts, and parts are important. But we have to keep in mind that there's also relationships between all of those parts. And if we forget to appreciate that part of it, then we're not looking at the whole. Okay, so when I talk about holistic management, I'm talking about the biological part meshing with the financial part, meshing with the people part, all based on predetermined goals that you set. I'm not telling you what your goals should be. In fact, I shouldn't tell you. It's one of my favorite things in working for some of the places that I do when I get handed what my goals are going to be that year. Okay? How much ownership do you think I have in those? Not a lot. Or when I got really excited about holistic management and I wrote up my family's goal while I was away on a trip and I came home and I handed it to my wife and I said, "Dear, here's our goals." She said, "Thank you for that. You can have it right back." She didn't necessarily disagree with the goals, but she wasn't part of the creation. She didn't get involved with the process. Now we have something that both of us have mutual interest in and created together. Makes all the difference. Okay, so what are some of those principles that in my opinion, are very important for making the water cycle, the mineral cycle, diversity, and the flow of energy in the right way? How to make all those things happen. And I'll go through each of these in several slides, but armor on the soil surface, you can call it residue, you can call it thatch. Please don't call it trash. Okay, now if you're trying to seed through something, you say, oh, there's just way too much. Why do you think there's too much? The live animal that is your soil biological community is not digesting it quick enough. Okay, be patient. Look at tools that can be used in order to cycle that quicker. We have producers now that would give anything to have thousands of pounds of residue on their soil surface because they can't keep it there for more than a couple months. And we're froze up for like 6 months out of the year. But it is cycling so quick because their biology is so hungry and operating at such a high level. That's why I call it armor. It needs more emphasis than it gets with traditional terms. Diversity, we talked about that some. I will cover that a little bit more. Continual live plant root, something we have on our perennial pastures, something we don't necessarily have in our annual situation. And especially when you have diversity, all of a sudden you have the opportunity to grow something every hour of every day that conditions are such that something can grow. But if all you have is one species or a couple of species, you get more and more limited to what that window of conditions is. Appropriate disturbance, we're going to talk about the grazing component and all of the other things that can be utilized as well. Adequate recovery time, a very important component to follow up. And of course, taking your reward, please. And I'll just let you think on that one. We'll get to it here in a minute. Some of the examples that I'm going to give, and I know this is a forage and a grazing council type of workshop, so I know where the focus is. But some of the examples that I'm going to use are going to be all over the place. There's things that I use from a grazing environment. There's things, or I should say a perennial grassland environment. There's things that I use from an annual cropping environment. There's things that I might even throw in there from a gardening situation. All of those still function with soil. All of those still have a water cycle, mineral cycle, plus the other two. So in order to illustrate the point, don't be turned off or think, well, I'll just bypass this slide because he's talking about cropping and I don't crop, or he's talking about gardening and, of course, we just graze cows. Concepts, the principles, they're still common. This one here was in 2006, and one of the things that we've really worked on in the last, well, going on 8 years now, is cover cropping. In its cover crops, it's mixture of forage crops, it's cover crop cocktails, whatever terms you may have heard. It's putting a multiple species mixed together, seeding it all at the same time, and allowing it to grow together. Mimicking that native prairie that we have with all of that diversity of warm seasons and cool seasons and flowers and broadleafs and legumes and the whole bit. Well, in 2006, we got about 1.5 inches of moisture through the entire growing season. Okay, this year was seeded about the middle of June. Here's about 6 weeks later on July 31st. This particular day here was 104 degrees air temperature. And this is just a monoculture of oilseed radish. You see, some of the species that we were encouraged to plant, or that we brainstormed and thought we would plant, we didn't even know what some of them were going to look like. Okay, so we planted them as singles. And then we thought, well, if we planted them as singles, let's see what kind of diversity we actually need. So then we went in 2-way combinations, and then 3-way and 4-way, all the way up to 7-way. This here is oilseed radish by itself. Would you want to take your haybine or swather or whatever mower you use, would you want to go across there and make hay? Okay, it's throwing a flag as white as the cloths on these tables. Okay, it's given up. It's done. Planted at the recommended rate. Okay, air temperature 104, temperature of that soil in that top inch, 107, top couple inches actually, 107 degrees. How well do you operate in 107 degrees? Now, if you asked my wife, she'd say perfect. Okay, before she met me, she was on her way to Arizona. How I convinced her not to go, I'm not sure. But the point is, some people really like it hot, but most of us prefer something less than that, right? Something a little more moderate. About 150 feet away, same soil type, same moisture conditions, same planting method. There's no fertilizer on any of this. Okay, so everything's the same except we planted 7 species together rather than just 1. We have close to 7,000 pounds of dry matter production. This 4-foot plant right here, guess what species that is? Oilseed radish. Same as this one. Cover on that soil, whether it's residue and cover on the soil surface, whether it's canopy cover that takes over and becomes that second layer at times. Look at the temperature here, 87 degrees. Is that a little more doable for you? Certainly would be for me. That's still probably 20 degrees hotter than what I would prefer if I got my choice, and about 17 degrees hotter than what the soil biology tends to like. Okay? But this was our biggest wake-up call right here, was the fact that aren't plants supposed to compete? Okay? Aren't we supposed to seed one thing and kill everything else that tries to come into that same area? Well, what's that telling us? It likes diversity. It wants diversity. And here it just showed wondrously what diversity can do and how they feed each other and how they complement each other, how it's truly a team and a community rather than a competition. But if you look at these different temperatures, 100% of your moisture is used for growth at about 70 degrees. You bump that up just to 100 degrees, which we were over that on the first slide. 15% of our moisture is used for growth. 85% is evaporation or transpiration and just survival. If you can keep your soil temperatures cooler, even 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 20 degrees like this one, do you think that would provide some benefit for the moisture that you do get? How much moisture do you get in this area annually? 40, 45, okay, 36, 46, okay? You're still more than twice what we are. Now, there's other areas that will say, well, North Dakota is twice what they are. You get into the western United States. But does the water cycle then cease to exist depending on the amount of moisture that you get? No, it's still there. How well it functions is determined by our management, but the point is that we can do some things to help make that moisture effective. Okay, there's often a story I tell about there's one rancher that came in and he said, well, we're at a 3-day holistic management course and it was based on grazing and cropping, and he said, well, I probably don't need to worry about that so much. And I said, why do you think you don't need to worry about it? He said, well, you're talking about a 16-inch moisture region. I said, yeah. And he said, I'm closer to 32. He said, I got twice what you got. I said, so? And he said, well, he's like, I can lose half my moisture and I still get as much as you do and grow as much as you do. Sure, but could you do it on less acres? Okay, is the land price dropped? Farmland, cropland, pasture land dropped here? It certainly hasn't in my area. If you can buy yourself a whole nother ranch or rent a whole nother ranch without actually having to buy or rent a whole nother ranch. Okay, a lot of times forage production is based on the amount of moisture that you get as well as a number of other factors, but this here plays a big role in making that happen. Okay, how about, and of course diversity played a very large role in that process as well. Continue a live root to build soils. Okay, doesn't matter how dry, how wet it is on our cropland soils, we're constantly putting something back in. It's not going to grow in the bin, the seed's not going to grow in the bag. Okay, we have to give it a shot. Now, do we have to figure economics into all of this? Certainly. But the more you build your soil health, the more you can stretch the window of what's possible. All of a sudden, some of the rules of thumb that you maybe use as far as planting time and number of seeds per acre and those sorts of things, all of a sudden some of those can start to change a little bit. You have more latitude, you have more flexibility. This particular ranch here, which I will highlight at the end of this presentation, got a rainfall event in the middle of June in 2009 that they got over 12 inches in about 5.5 hours. Now that's an intense rainfall in our area. This is darn near a year's worth of moisture in a quarter of a day. Okay, now maybe rainfall events like this are more common in your area. I'm not sure. But in this one here, I asked him, I said, do you have any estimate on how much of that moisture you put in the ground and how much ran off? And he said, well, he said, Josh, and this is Gabe Brown, for those of you that maybe read about him or heard him speak. And he said, well, he said, even though it was the middle of the night, he said, curiosity got me. And he said, you know, my rain gauge is only a 6-inch rain gauge. So he said, as soon as that filled up and I had to dump it out so I could keep collecting moisture, he said, I went for a walk down his driveway. And on his driveway, it's about a quarter mile. He's got cropland fields on both sides at a little bit of a slope. Not a lot, but a little bit. And he talked that he thought he missed his opportunity because he was sure that when he went out there, things would already be running, okay, after 6 inches, and that he wouldn't know exactly where it stopped infiltrating and started running. Well, he went out there and he said there was no water setting at all at 6 inches. And so then he waited and he went back, checked the range gauge at 7 inches. Still no ponding, still no running. Okay, he went back at 8 inches. Still no ponding, still no running. And while he was out on his walk between 8 and 9 inches, he said, is when it finally started to run across the ground. If you can take in, and of course water holding capacity in different soils is different, okay? And it's important how much water holding capacity there is, how much organic matter, but if you can take in 8 inches at a shot, what would that do for moisture availability later for you? Okay? In North Dakota, if we can get all our rainfall in one day, we certainly take it, but only if we can actually keep it, because it's not going to do us much good if we get that much rain and it all leaves the place, or 90% of it leaves the place. Diversity in continuous roots, here's just a diagram. Smooth brome grass is something pretty common in our area, and unfortunately so is Canada thistle. Okay? And when you have a very monoculturist type of environment and plant community, you see where other things try and fill the void. And you see how they can be dominant or become dominant over time. Now let's throw in some other species, and preferably we would have all kinds of species, shallow rooted, moderate rooted, deep rooted, fibrous roots, tap roots, nitrogen fixers, phosphorus gatherers, all of those sorts of things, all in a community. And how big a role do you think the thistle can play then? Will you still have one from time to time? Probably. Is that necessarily bad? It pumps minerals, it provides minerals. If you ever bricks test or some of those things on some of these weeds at certain times of the year, they'll blow away from a nutritional content some of the grasses. Okay? But we don't like to see them. Okay? Some of them we certainly don't like to touch if they're thorny. But the idea is that they not only tell us something, but they do play a role. We just don't want them to play this dominant role that's on some landscapes they tend to do. Okay, appropriate disturbance. Is mowing the same as grazing? If you take a cutter bar out there and you cut off and you have this nice uniform cut, is that the same as having a cow out there? How come? What does a cow bring to the table? And it could be any animal. I'm just using a cow as an example. What does she leave behind? Manure, urine, biology, saliva, hair. Okay? They have a very unique and particular digestive system with being a ruminant and the way that can function and taking low quality or lower quality forage, turning it into high quality protein. They play a very specific and very adapted role to this type of environment. You do the same with grazing. Can you have some harvest efficiency? Sure. But what comes before efficiency? Effectiveness, right? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever hay. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have a contingency plan if you need to feed hay at a certain time of year. We have that all the time. We have to have our insurance plan in place. But we're not going to live that worst case scenario every day that we don't have to. Okay? In our Hayland fields, especially in this situation, we have a producer a good friend of mine actually, that there is never a hay bale that ever leaves the field it is produced on. So yes, there's a little bit of nutrients that are taken off in the form of beef when those animals leave or the calves, grow up. But most of the carbon, most of the nitrogen, most of the other nutrients that are left there, the most potent part of the nutrient, which is the urine, that you generally don't take from the lots and are able to take back out to the field. Most of the biology that dies when you pile up manure because it heats up too much, even though you might spread it out on the fields, you don't take that back out there. And all of the other intricate relationships that happen between a living grazing animal and a living plant that don't happen between a living plant and a non-living mechanical piece of equipment. All of those advantages come back out here. These are two hay fields, one that is fed on, one that is not fed on in the fall of the year. Which one's harvesting solar energy? Now, does that change some of the management? Does that mean that you have to look at water and fencing and some other things? Yes. Capital investment to improve the property. And do you do it all at once? Probably not. Look at what's most effective. What's the next best use of your hour of time and dollar of money? Recovery. We can have tremendous impact. And that can be a good thing. We can stimulate a lot of things. But what must always follow that tremendous impact is the appropriate recovery time. Okay? Grazing fescue, how long do you leave it after you graze it before you come back? This is a learning opportunity for Josh. Okay? How long do you generally, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or longer? Spring in the 2 weeks, okay, during more fast growth type of scenario. Okay? And that's judging that particular species, right, on when it's ready to graze again. So if you always, and this is maybe where I might touch on a nerve, okay, but if you always manage your fescue to graze it once it's recovered, what are you doing to manage the other species? Are you giving them an opportunity to actually come into the picture? Now, if you have a very dominant species, you do have to manage what you have available. That's your resource. That's your feed source. That's what takes care of your animals. So I'm not saying that you just forget about the fescue and manage for these other ones. But if you can put in a management system that gives you maybe a longer recovery period or a more intensive impact or maybe a combination of both, And I heard a speaker yesterday that talked about some of the benefits and some of the diversity that came into the system by doing that. Do it on a real small acreage. Do it on a real small area and see what happens. But recovery has to be a part of that equation. Okay? And it's not just recovery of plants or a specific plant. It's recovery of the plants, it's recovery of the soil surface, it's recovery of soil biology and who left the party and who came back to the party. Okay? The succession of germination of seeds, all of those things get figured into this whole ecosystem recovery, not just any given plant or several plants. And take your reward. If you manage for higher levels of soil health, what do you think your reward is? It's a whole list of things. None more than this visual right here. On the right side, we took over a farm. It's the district, soil district owns it. It's a demonstration farm. On the right side, we have very low crop diversity, very common in our area to raise wheat on wheat on wheat, and maybe flax once in a while, and maybe summer fallow, which means you go in and you tear it up, you plow it for a year, thinking that you're storing moisture. Okay, not the case. Plus, we don't use any cover crops on that field. That's our control field, and no animals are allowed on it, ever. Okay, on the left-hand side, we take all 4 crop types. Plus, we add in a diversity of cover crops, and we put animal impact in the form of mob grazing of cattle and sheep on that ground. For 3 years, do you see a difference between those two soils? And no, I didn't wait for a rainfall event to grab one and grab the other one on a 100-degree day. In fact, my supervisor and I dug these soils the exact same time with witnesses on these 2 fields, which are only separated by just a grass buffer in between that allows us to drive between our 10 fields. There's one of these soils that I would much rather prefer moving forward, no matter what the conditions are. Okay, this is part of your reward that you can take, and this is the way that this ecosystem, this creation, this infrastructure then can give us what we need in terms of food and fiber and all of those things. Okay, I'm going to end with a couple of examples here. The first one is Blackleg Ranch. It's probably about 30 miles south and east of Bismarck. This particular operation is multifaceted, multi-generational. They really focus on not only profitability, but they focus on quality of life, and they focus on sharing their story with other people. They have a hunting enterprise, they have an agritourism enterprise, they have a custom grazing enterprise, which is what you see here. It's yearlings. There's 3,000 in that particular group. They're moved as one group and kept as one group. They also have cow-calf. They have some cropping. They have a lot going on. But with this particular tool, do you think they're getting some impact on that ground? For the 2 boys that had to create a new enterprise to come back to the operation, okay, they weren't allowed to just rent more acres and buy more cows. They had to bring some diversity onto the place. This, a lot of times, becomes their tool of choice to prep wildlife habitat for the next year. If you want to stimulate production, if you want to add fertility, if you want to cycle nutrients, and you want to get more diversity and more growth, they trample it down with those animals, keeping in mind that they still have to move quick enough to where they're providing the nutrition that they need so they can get the pounds of gain. Okay? It's custom grazing. Cattle buyers don't bring their animals to your place so they can trample down grass. Okay? They want pounds of beef at the end of the season. So it's a combination of both. But after that, then this biological diversity tends to spring up. It tends to come. How many different kinds of seeds do you think you have in your seed bank? Okay, 40, 50. Some say, well, I never see anything, so I must not have any. I would beg to differ. They've just never had the opportunity. If you want to give them the opportunity, you need to probably consider doing something different than you're currently doing. Okay, if you do the same thing over and over and over again, you're always going to get what you've always got. But if you want to create something different, pick 1 acre. Pick a 100-foot by 100-foot area. Give it tremendous impact. Give it a long recovery period. Keep it fenced off. See what happens. That's very low risk. That's experimentation that you can do this year. Observations that you can make this coming year. you can do some of your own experimentation. You don't have to have, although they're wonderful resources, you don't have to wait for the university or for research centers to do those. They will do those as well, and then you can collaborate on those things. But generally, it will start with a producer trying something somewhere, somehow. Now, one of the other unique things that they do is they bridge their cropping and their grazing. They understand they want animals on all of their cropland acres every year that they possibly can. How do they get them out there? They plant cover crops, either after the crop has been harvested, or some years they will plant the cover crop cocktail as the crop that year. Plant it in the spring or early summer, let it grow all growing season long, graze it into the fall, into the winter, because that lowers their feed bill and that works on soil health, so they're feeding both above and below ground species. They put it together like this. They want all of these things listed across the top. Those are their resource concerns, from providing habitat to providing nutrition to providing carbon, working on the water cycle, all of those things, and then they start matching species that will fit to that. All these are planted together. All of these are allowed to grow. They utilize this ground for hunting purposes, first of all, and then they graze it later with the cow. Okay? Now the boys will tell you, in forage like this, it's a little unnerving when they're the ones that had to crawl through the jungle to chase up birds, and the gunfires and the gunshots would start going off and you couldn't see anything. Okay? Now they have dogs. But you're looking at all that kind of forage. Imagine what that can do from a feeding standpoint. Okay? We did some nutritional analysis, found out that these cows, being as though they're quite a few months away from calving, okay, in our area, we try and calve in the late spring, early summer. Not saying that's exactly what you should do, okay? But understand that we do it because we used to calve in February. We used to calve in January, February. Listening to what I've told you just a little bit about the weather that we have, could you think of anything more ridiculous? Okay, but there's all kinds of ear warmers for calves and heated huts that we can buy and spread out across the corral and all of those. Money not needed when we try and match multiple layers of variables and try and match our reproductive cycle to that. Okay. The other thing we took is to measure the herd below ground. We look at that cover crop that was seeded for a full season that year before, and we look on that in terms of if we put corn on it, what did the biology do? If we put another cover crop back on it right away, what did it do? And you can see diversity breeds diversity. How far that will go or what numbers we should try and get to, I'm not sure. All I know is they were very low to begin with, and building them is of utmost interest to us. And the last thing, which wasn't necessarily an outcome that they were after, was this idea of getting the cattle off of the sensitive riparian areas, getting them out of the lots where they had to haul manure then again the next year, getting them out where they can move around, where they can work on the mineral cycle even during the winter months, where they can lower their feed bill, all of these things. I used to build feedlots. Okay, my background is engineering. I built feedlots for years, designed them, installed them, monitored them. And each one that I built cost that producer anywhere from $100,000 to probably about $800,000. This was 10 or 12 years ago. Okay? This here, we built a little bit of fence. We do have to bury the pipeline pretty deep to get water there, and then a little bit of management. And you want to talk about a low cost and effective way of managing those animals. Here we go. Now, do we have the advantage that our soils freeze up and gives us a pretty long period of time, and maybe you don't have quite that same luxury? Certainly. But as you build your soils, you will have more structure and more flexibility to put animals on ground like that without the negative impacts that maybe were there when you have a soil in poor health. Okay, last one I'll finish up with is Brown's Ranch, which I highlighted the soils that took in over 8 inches from Gabe and Paul Brown's place. This here they're utilizing in order to create cover on the soil surface, stimulate the mineral cycle, enhance the water cycle. They're using a little over 300 yearling heifers that are grazing on 1/3 of an acre units, okay, on this cropland field. And they're moved every couple of hours. Who here wants to move cattle every 2 hours? Okay, they don't either. They set it up in the morning with solar-powered automatic gate openers. Takes them about an hour in the morning to set it up, and the cattle move themselves all day. They can go out to the field, they can go to a conference, they can do whatever they want to do. They come home in the evening, make sure the water's good, let the cattle have access to everything that they grazed that particular day, come back the next day, take another hour to hour and a half to set it up in the early morning when it's too wet to do much else, and they do it all again. And they do this only for about a month to prep that particular field, because that particular field, which was these species, okay, right here, mostly cool season type species, this is what it looked like when it was done. There isn't a square inch of ground that's bare. There isn't a square foot that hasn't been impacted somehow, some way. And of course, they go back in then, and in this case, it was the next year, they go back in with residue and soil surface that's been prepped by animals. This is a no-till planter where they seeded corn. No herbicide application needed because all the ground's covered. The only problem is even though they use no-till as one of their tools, they often get asked, because by July 1st it looks like this, and they've gotten quite a few questions about why they cultivate their corn if they're no-tillers. They don't cultivate their corn. But they have biology that you probably wouldn't want to become face-to-face with, because they're hungry, and they're intense, and their job of cycling nutrients, they've had to actually start taking legumes back out of their equation because their fertility is so good and so high that they need more and more carbon to feed the system because the biology are that hungry. And then it allows them to do things like this. Zero commercial fertility, maybe one herbicide application every second or third year, depending on how the rotation works out. And county average is right at about 100 for our county, with full fertility and full other inputs. Now, is this the flagship? Is this the guy that's way, way out in front? It certainly is. But a lot of times we need to see that one that's stretched way out there to think, you know, if we're raising 100 bushel corn right now, maybe we can raise 120. But that doesn't mean we just dump more nitrogen on it, or we find a better hybrid. We've got plenty good enough genetics to do the things that we need to do. What we need is nutrition from our soils in order to take that next step, that next leap, and hit that next level. Now, just to make sure that all of this played out and that he wasn't shorting the crop any, he wanted to make sure he could sleep at night, which this individual, he only sleeps about 3 to 4 hours per night anyway, because he's always thinking and always kind of amped up. But he took all of these main elemental nutrients and looked at them, and all of those are in the sufficient category. Some of them are either bumping into the high category. He could have added more fertility, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have made much difference. And he's done that in the past. He's done full fertility, half fertility, and no fertility. And it's to the point now where his no fertility is the one that's out-competing most of it, because it's gone overboard on the other ones where you still put in fertility. So how is that happening? His soil tests will tell you that he only has a few pounds of phosphorus and a few pounds of nitrogen. Not near enough to raise 160 bushel corn. Where does the rest of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and other minerals come from? The math doesn't add up. He's been called a liar many times. And yet he has someone actually come out and harvest his fields for him once in a while and have them weigh it with a weigh wagon in order to make sure that there's no way possible that he would have the numbers different or backwards or anything. And his intent never would be anyway. But it's the biological activity that takes place. You see, when we have a standard soil test, we're measuring plant available or inorganic nutrients, right? And you can use nitrogen for an example. Does that mean that there's no organic nitrogen that's mineralized throughout the season? Well, there certainly is. How much of it is it out there? And there's some labs out there now that are starting to be able to test for that. But until we started testing for his soils, for the soil food web, which we're talking about testing for populations of bacteria and fungi and protozoa and mycorrhizal colonization, then all of a sudden they can start putting together an estimate. And his estimate was over 200 pounds of nitrogen available per acre, slow release over the entire season. That's part of the story. I'm not saying this captures everything, but it's part of the story as to why this happens. Principle behind this, soil health pays. Doesn't matter if it's grassland, doesn't matter if it's cover crop, doesn't matter if it's annual crop, doesn't matter if it's hayland, it pays. Are they going to hand you cash? No. but they are going to help you build something that you maybe weren't able to build before. Here's just a quick comparison of that mob grazed cover crop that I showed you. They did that 2 years in a row. The field on the other side of the tree row, they did the same thing, but they didn't have any grazing on it. Okay? Difference in organic matter over 2 years, and of course this is just measured in the top 6 inches, 1.2% difference. Higher where there was livestock, managed intensely. Compared to their soil organic matter in their native prairie, which they think that's even lower than it should be because that wasn't always grazed appropriately, they have a ways to go. Okay, they're just using that as kind of a reference, so to speak. They think big. We all think everybody should think big. But thinking big doesn't mean pushing, pushing, pushing. Sometimes it means backing off a little bit, backing off a little bit. Sometimes it means treating your ground like you would if you were trying to build strength or build muscle or be a weightlifter. If you go and you lift weights, let's say you're going to lift arms one particular day, and those that have gone through weight training programs or sports probably can relate to this in some way, shape, or form, but when you lift, say arms, do you go back the next day and lift arms again? And then lift arms again the next day and the next day and the next day? No. You lift it one day, you lift it pretty intense, and then what do? You give it rest. And you give it enough rest to where the stress that you put on this not only allows it to heal to get back to where it was, and my arms are not a good example, okay? But to get it back to where it was, and then where should it go from there? It actually should get bigger, and it should get stronger. And it's living, it's tied up in biology, it's tied up in a number of things. We're trying to create that same type of pattern of providing good stress or stimulation, long recovery to let it build bigger than it was before, and then go offer it some more and back again. But we have to, timing is real critical in that whole deal. And sustainability for the future, I think this is really important. This is that pasture walk that I told you about a little earlier with the dung beetles. But probably more importantly, I want to leave you with this. Cartoon here, it says, the son says to his father, he says, I'm leaving home to seek my fortune. And his father says, what about the livestock, the fields, and the barn? And he says, I already looked there. I want these guys to look again. But I want them to look again with a different set of eyes and a support network. One that is excited about agriculture, one that is excited about agriculture for the right reasons, about soils, about quality food, about making money, and being able to do it with your family, with multiple generations, and most importantly with community, and it not being a competition, but being that team approach that we talked about earlier. Any questions? Seriously? Nothing? So either I lost y'all or you're waiting for me to walk out so you can close the door. There we go.
Just one. Is there a quick way to explain why he was pulling legumes out?
Good question. The question was, is there a good way to explain why he was pulling legumes out of his mixes in this particular case? And we're talking about the Brown's Ranch. And a lot of that's tied in to the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Okay? And if you think of soils, and I'm trying to, it's probably a little more complex than this, but if you think of soils at being 10 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, and that's where everything kind of decays down to. Okay? So it gets down to this level of being that 10 parts to 1 part. Well, if you have something like a wheat stubble, let's say, or corn stalks, you're upwards of 60 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, or even 80 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. But now if you throw a legume in there, that is probably more like 15 or 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, which is much closer. That means that combination of that legume and that higher carbon plant, the wheat or the corn, will decay that much quicker because it has a partner to go along with it. But since his fertility in his soils is as high as it is, and is producing, through the Hui-2 excretion process and party process, so to speak, of the biology, there's quite a bit of nitrogen that's getting fed back to those plants. And when that happens, then they're going to produce more, but also cycle quicker. Okay, so by pulling out the legumes, you leave that carbon part intact longer. Therefore, your soil surface cover on there longer. And his idea is that if his soil surface cover could disappear about the same time that his plants provide complete canopy cover, he would be okay with that. But as you saw in that picture, he was starting to get bare ground before his corn plants were even able to start, crossing over and connecting row to row, which means that his soil temperatures are going up. Okay, when the sun, especially at that point in the summer when it's a more direct hit, his moisture, there's a greater chance of evaporation when he would get moisture, and all of a sudden the water cycle doesn't function as effectively because the mineral cycle was kind of on steroids, so to speak. It was just functioning at such a high level. So it's tied up in that carbon to nitrogen ratio, and he's always kind of playing with that. If he needs more carbon because he needs more cover, it'll be more carbon plants and less nitrogen type plants. When he first started, it was the other way. He needed more fertility. He wasn't cycling. When he first started no-till, he'd get 3 or 4 years of material built up that wouldn't cycle through. So he needed more legumes, he needed more nitrogen, and as he got that balance, now he's gone past the optimal point, and he's got to kind of bring it back just a little bit.
You need to go on to break now to stay on time, but let's give Joshua a big